You're live now.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. Well, good evening, everyone. This is Northern Virginia Transportation Commission Chair Katie Crystal speaking, joined with some background noise assist by my toddler. I apologize for the distractions. We are beginning the May 6th meeting of the NVTC promptly at 7:01 p.m. now by my count. Thank you all so much for joining us. Welcome. Given the ongoing public health emergency, we are, of course, continuing to conduct meetings electronically. Please let it be known that our commission staff followed all of the procedures and guidelines spelled out in the legislation that enables us to meet virtually to give adequate notice to not only commissioners, but also relevant staff and certainly the public. This meeting is simultaneously being broadcast on YouTube tonight to those listening in. Just a couple of reminders at this point, second nature to everyone. If you could mute when you're not talking, that cuts down on background noise. We have that chat function available, but please remember no business to be conducted there. So welcome to use it for technical difficulties, etc. But comments about the actual work before us should happen live. And when it comes time to a vote, it helps us very much if you could just identify yourself as the maker or seconder of the motion. We know that Chairman McKay of Fairfax County is unable to attend tonight's meeting, so Mr. Stork, whom I think is with us, welcome, will be voting as his alternate for the issues before us that require a vote. So, beginning with roll call, let me turn it over to our Commission Secretary, Ms. Rhonda Gilchrist, to do that.
Good evening. Please respond with here or present after you hear your name. Chair Crystal.
Here.
Mr. Gary.
Present.
Mr. Alcorn.
Here.
Mr. Bell. Ms. Bennett Parker.
Here.
Mr. De Ferranti.
Here.
Mr. Eben.
Here.
Ms. Filler-Korn.
Present.
Mr. Faust. Ms. Garvey.
Here.
Mr. Krizik.
Here.
Mr. Letourneau.
Here.
Mr. Meyer.
Here.
Ms. Pelchik.
Present.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Smedberg.
Present.
Mr. Snyder.
Here.
Mr. Stork.
Present.
Mr. Sullivan.
Here.
Mr. Turner.
Here.
Mr. Walkinshaw.
Here.
And Ms. Mitchell is an alternate.
Here.
We do have quorum. The following staff are participating in the meeting. Executive Director Kate Mattice, Director of Finance and Administration Scott Kalkworth, Director of Programs and Policy Alan Fye, NVTC Commission Secretary Rhonda Gilchrist, Web and IT Manager Melissa Walker, WMATA Program Manager Andrew DeVetter, Commuter Choice Senior Program Manager Ben Owen, Transit Resource Center Program Manager Dan Goldfarb, Program Analyst Zachary Smith, Program Analyst Dina Gurma, NVTC Legal Counsel Steve McIsaac, VRE Chief Executive Officer Rich Dalton, VRE Chief Financial Officer Mark Schofield, WMATA's Virginia Government Relations Officer Greg Potts, and DRPT Chief of Public Transportation Jennifer DeBrule. I'll turn it back to the chair.
Great. Well, thank you all again so much for joining us. Just a very quick preview of our agenda tonight. We have just a few action items, and yet quite a few other areas of content to cover. So we have a consent agenda, which will include our electronic meeting resolution, as well as a letter that certifies that we've received certain documents from WMATA, those that are required by state code. We will also have an action item on some amendments to our MOA with the Commonwealth on Transform 66. That's the Inside the Beltway project. Largely technical, but we will have commentary from DRPT Director Jennifer Mitchell to explain those when we get there. We will also have a vote on VRE's operating and access agreement, as well as amended master lease agreement with CSX, one of our two host railroads, at least for now, until the Commonwealth becomes our host railroad. And then we'll have some again, non-action items, but ones that are nevertheless really important, including an update on commuter choice, some recommendations for project funding under the 95 and 395 program, an update on the commission's budget itself, the operations of the commission and the commission staff, and their work plan for the year ahead, a federal legislative update, an update from our transit resource center, on recent transit trends of interest to all of us, I know, as we try to understand coming back and what impact that's going to have on our transit network. A DRPT presentation on the Springfield to Quantico Enhanced Public Transportation Study. And then finally, we will have a closed session to discuss a VRE personnel matter. You should have received materials on that last one directly from me earlier this week. If you haven't, please do shoot me a note at some point during the meeting so I can get those to you. You can see again on the screen, we have a full agenda tonight. So let's launch right in with our consent agenda. We have 2 items, the resolution to conduct this meeting electronically, probably second nature to all of us at this point, as well as authorizing Ms. Matthijs as our executive director to certify that we have received documents, reporting documents from WANA. Those are required by state code. We do have some public comments tonight, actually, which we were delighted to receive. And so before we entertain a motion on the consent agenda, let me ask our executive director, Ms. Matthijs, to describe those comments from the public.
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair. And indeed, 3 comments were received from the public prior to the meeting. One of them supported a return to more frequent metro service. One supported NVTC's use of disadvantaged business enterprises in engineering contracts. And one supporting 2 of our commuter choice projects. The comments regarding the commuter choice projects will be included in the docket for that program. That public comment period is actually open right now. And all of these comments were sent to the commission in advance of this meeting.
Thank you so much, Ms. Matthijs. Any discussion on those? I think that for the comments, particularly about return to bus service for WMATA, we'll have an opportunity to talk with our 2 Virginia representatives on the WMATA board about plans for returning to bus service. We actually got some good news shortly before this meeting about expansions in service, but any queries or comments on the outreach to disadvantaged business enterprises? Okay, hearing none. Let's go ahead and move into the consent agenda. I would like to ask the floor or ask if anyone has a motion from the floor to approve that consent agenda.
Madam Chair, move the consent agenda. Kanik, Alexandria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Do we have a second?
Second, Commissioner Palchik.
Thank you very much, Ms. Palchik. All right, that's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the consent agenda items?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Please, Mr. Evans.
I'm just kind of curious, do we have any thoughts as to when we will be returning to in-person meetings? Do we have any thought as to whether that's going to happen this fall or this summer at all?
I'm so glad you asked. I was planning to get to that at the end of the night, but we should probably do it while everyone's fresh. We just had a chance to chat about this with the executive committee, and a big thank you to Ms. Matthijs and the staff have been trying to figure out what kind of technology options and infrastructure we have and need to test to allow us to come back on sort of a hybrid basis. So those commissioners who are interested in returning, I count myself as one of them. I really miss seeing you all in 3 dimensions. And I think that seemed to be a consensus among our executive committee members. But so those of us who wish to return could return. And those for whom, health concerns remain paramount can continue to dial in virtually so long as the state of emergency allows us to do that. So the good news is that our staff team at NVTC has been working on the equipment, that we have the infrastructure, so to speak, to do that and to continue to live stream our meetings, take public comment virtually, etc. So the tentative plan is that they would have some time to test all of that with the goal of having us have the option of doing those hybrid meetings in July. What we'd like to do is send out just a very short survey to the commissioners to get a sense of who would like to be back in person so that they can plan accordingly for distancing, technology, etc. So I don't know if you have any other comments or if anybody else, any other members of the commission wanted to share thoughts or high-level reactions now before we survey.
Just to follow up, I'm not suggesting that we rush, but I'm thinking that as more and more people are vaccinated, we should be prepared for the governor at some point to lift the state of emergency. And I don't know whether July is an appropriate time or whether the fall, but I just think I'm glad to hear that you're thinking ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're right, due to point, Ms. Perrin-Seibert was mentioning to us that there's some machinations happening in the governor's administration about those orders and when that might be lifted. And so all of this plan assumes that we are making that decision, and it's possible that decision may be made for us if they lift the state of emergency earlier than our July meeting. Great. All right. Okay. So thank you for that excellent question. And please, commissioners, do look for a short survey coming to your inboxes soon. Okay. So that covered, I think we have a motion that has been seconded on the floor. If there is no further discussion, I will turn it back to our secretary to please call the roll.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we
Oh,
can.
sorry, I hit the wrong button. Chair Crystal,
Aye.
Mr. Aguirre,
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn,
Aye.
Mr. Bell, Ms. Bennett Parker,
Aye.
Mr. De Ferenti,
Aye.
Mr. Evan,
Aye.
Ms. Filler-Corn,
Aye.
Mr. Faust, Ms. Garvey,
Aye.
Mr. Krizik,
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau,
Aye.
Mr. Meyer,
Aye.
Ms. Pelchik,
Aye.
Mr. Reed, Mr. Smedberg,
Aye.
Mr. Snyder,
Aye.
Mr. Stork,
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan,
Aye.
Aye, thank you. Mr. Turner?
Aye.
Mr. Walkinshaw?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ms. Gilchrist. All right, then moving on to the meat of our agenda, starting with commuter choice. We have one action for this item. As I mentioned, Shirley, I'll turn things over to Director Mitchell to talk to us about some proposed amendments the Commonwealth is bringing forward to the MOA for our Transform 66 Inside the Beltway project. We will hear a report from the Joint Commission Working Group. As a reminder, when it comes to the 395 money, we make recommendations in partnership with our other commission, the PRTC. And then we will also have an update from our Program Advisory Committee Chair, Mr. Snyder, who will report on both the working group and the ongoing Program Advisory Committee from their April 22nd meeting. And then we will conclude with Mr. Van Owen from our commission staff to give a presentation on the staff recommendations for the 395 corridor round 2 scoring. So let me start actually on that first item, 4A, and turn it over to you, Director Mitchell, to talk to us a little bit about these technical edits on the 66 MOA.
Great. Thank you, Chair Crystal. This is what we're bringing forward today is a technical amendment to the I66 Inside the Beltway Memorandum of Agreement. It really is a technical fix that we found while we were doing some additional financial due diligence. And it makes one change to the text, which originally we had unintentionally limited the amount of debt service that could be utilized for the rail improvements to the amount not to exceed the annual NVTC contemplated payout. It really was not intended to do that. The new language really fixes the error by excluding the payment of the annual NVTC amount in deriving the funding system that is then available for debt service and rail components. It really was, I think, a drafting error. We discovered it while we were doing some additional work with our financial advisors, and they've recommended that we change the language so that it's much clearer and meets the intent of the agreement. We also made a few minor changes that really are just cleaning up some naming conventions, but nothing substantive. So we have provided it to Kate Mattice and to Steve McIsaac for their review. And I think they're also of the same opinion that it is not a substantive change either. So that's what we are bringing forward to you all for your consideration and hopefully approval tonight.
Thank you, Director Mitchell. I don't know if Ms. Mattice or Mr. McIsaac, if anyone from the NVTC staff team wants to chime in. If not, I'm sure we have you at our ready for answering any questions commissioners may have about this.
So, Madam Chair, just indeed, and Steve, definitely welcome to chime in. We work very closely with Director Mitchell, and indeed, the language that they propose it actually, if anything, shores up a guarantee of funding for NVTC within it. And so we do not see it as being any risk to the NVTC payment.
Very important judgment to hear from our executive director before we approve this. All right, any questions? Just trying to scroll through and look at faces. Please don't be shy. Feel free to jump in if I'm missing you. Okay, seeing none, I think I would love to entertain a motion if anyone's got one.
So moved, John Bell.
Thank you, Senator Bell. Is there a
Second,
second?
Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Delegate Sullivan. Okay, that has been moved and seconded. Resolution 2443. Unless there is further discussion, back to Ms. Gilchrist to call the roll.
Chair Crystal,
Aye.
Mr. Gary,
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn,
Aye.
Mr. Bell,
Aye.
Ms. Bennett Parker,
Aye.
Mr. De Ferenti,
Aye.
Mr. Eben,
Aye.
Ms. Filler-Corn,
Aye.
Mr. Faust, Ms. Garvey,
Aye.
Mr. Krizik,
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau,
Aye.
Mr. Meyer,
Aye.
Ms. Palchuk,
Aye.
Mr. Reed, Mr. Smedberg.
Aye.
Was that you, Mr. Reed?
Yes, it was.
Thank you. Mr. Smedberg, yes.
Aye. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Snyder,
Yes.
Mr. Stork,
Yes.
Mr. Sullivan,
Aye.
Mr. Turner,
Aye.
Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
The motion passes. I'll turn it back to the chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, so moving through our commuter choice program item, we do have a presentation on the round 2 scoring and staff recommendations on the program of projects for 395 and 95. Before we get there, let me invite Ms. Mattice, actually speaking for Mr. McKay, who is the chair of our Joint Commission Working Group and who is unfortunately unavailable this evening, to present along with Mr. Snyder, who is the chair of our Program Advisory Committee, to talk about the meetings, the April meetings of those two groups. I think we'll go to you, Ms. Mattice, first.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madam Chair. And indeed, the I-395-95 Joint Commission Working Group, and that's commissioners for both NVTC and PRTC. They met to review the scoring results and the staff proposed programming approach for this next round of I-395-95 funding, which covers both fiscal year 22 and 23. And so the working group's recommendation to the full commission was to endorse what the staff had prepared for consideration to fund actually all 13 of the eligible projects that were proposed, along with NVTC's program administration costs for the next 2 years. And the working group agreed with the staff assessment that all the proposals supported the program goals of moving more people and expanding options, and that all of them made sense at this time. And that's actually something that we at staff had worked very carefully. How do those proposals reflect how the travel behavior is rebounding on that corridor? The other thing is we do have the opportunity here is that all 13 of these proposals do fit in within the available funding. And again, it's a real mark of a strong partnership between Transurban, who runs the express lanes, us and the Commonwealth, is that there has actually been the funding availability has met the expectations that we have the agreement that we signed with the Commonwealth just a couple of years ago. And so again, after the committee updates, Ben Owen will give us an overview of those proposals for under consideration, and including the scoring results, and he'll be happy to answer any questions that you have on those projects. And again, we have public comment is open right now, and so these will be coming back for a vote of approval by the commission at the next meeting following the public comment period. To date, we've already received 22 comments on these projects, and the public comment period is open through May 17th. So I'm happy to turn over to Mr. Snyder to talk about the Program Advisory Committee element of this joint meeting.
Sure, Madam Chair. So as Kate mentioned, part of the joint meeting was the Program Advisory Committee. recall that when we approved the initial round 4 program of projects last fall with revenue, this is the I-66 inside the Beltway projects, we anticipated that we'd have additional revenues this spring to advance a supplemental program of projects. Recall that we had a number of projects, but the funds weren't sufficient to fund all of them, and so some fairly highly ranked projects were carried over for potential supplemental funding this year. So we expect that some resources will arrive in the form of the initial $5 million contribution from the outside the Beltway Express Lanes concessionaire. We may also resume receiving some inside the Beltway toll payments from VDOT. But as we know, that the toll revenue on I-66 has trailed the sort of the rebound in revenue on 95, but there's some evidence that it is starting to come back. So the committee looked at all this again and agreed with staff's recommendation that instead of considering this supplemental round this spring, that we should wait until the fall till we have a better sense of the toll revenues, as well as getting the $5 million in hand. Then we would look to adopt any program before opening the next I-66 call for projects in November. So in essence, we're proposing the supplemental to sort of finish up the round 4, if you will, that we had to suspend as a result of the loss of toll revenue last year, earlier in the fall, and then later in the fall in November, then commence open the next round of projects. We also received updates on the Envision Route 7 bus rapid transit planning effort, and we'll hear more about that later this evening. And some interesting research that staff has begun on the topic of low and no fare strategies. Staff plans to present a white paper and convene a low fare, no fare, don't ask me to repeat that 10 times, a low fare, no fare roundtable at the July commission meeting. The committee's eager for that discussion with a full commission and thinks that it's really quite timely. It will be interesting to see what the experiments are going on in this region as well as elsewhere on that particularly important topic. So I'll turn it back to Chair Crystal for any questions about the Program Advisory Committee part of that joint meeting.
Thank you so much, Mr. Snyder, and thank you for the thoughtful recommendation. I'm going to, in the interest of consolidation, invite Mr. Owen to actually go next, and then we can have a discussion on all 3 pieces. But Mr. Owen has the staff recommendations for us on that 95-395 program.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Nice to be with you all again this evening after a busy couple months for our commuter choice team. So picking up on Kate's remarks, I'll be providing a short briefing tonight on the evaluation results and our programming recommendations for commuter choice on the I-395-95 corridor round 2. Next slide, please. So first, a quick recap of where we were in March. At that point, we'd completed our eligibility review and identified 13 eligible applications covering much of the corridor with a $21.9 million total funding request. Now, each of these proposals falls into one of 3 general compelling categories. The first being enhancements to local Dash and Fairfax connector bus routes. That's 3 of the proposals in the northern part of the corridor. These would all provide service every 15 minutes or better on these routes, at least on weekdays, thereby improving connections with Metro Rail, jobs, and services for commuters throughout the day. So the 2 Dash proposals actually include significant weekend service enhancements as well, really making these viable all-day, everyday services for people to use, as well as several improvements to several bus stops in the corridors along those routes with improved passenger information signs. The Fairfax connector Lorton to Franconia proposal also includes deployment of capital bike share in the Franconia Springfield area. So 4 proposed stations and locations that would serve residential and commercial concentrations and make use of the existing bike infrastructure in that area. Second general category, a few kind of motley efforts to rebuild ridership post-pandemic. and prepare for expected future travel patterns. These include park and ride lot expansions in Prince William County to the Horner Road lot, which prior to COVID-19 was basically full, all of its 2,300 spaces every day, as well as completing the funding for a new 700 space lot in Spotsylvania County. This category also includes financial incentives through Vanpool Alliance to rebuild Vanpool ridership in the corridor, both a general subsidy and, where necessary, a parking subsidy to reduce riders' out-of-pocket costs quite a bit, and also a new VRE feeder bus route in the Fredericksburg area. And finally, last but not least, continuations of new and enhanced Fairfax Connector and OmniRide bus services that were funded in round one, so these are operational now. This is a total of 6 services, and these continuations would provide an additional 2 years of operating support, thereby providing predictability and continuity for commuters as they return to their work sites. And as Kate indicated, we are expecting full funding of $30 million over the 2 fiscal years of the program. Next slide, please. A lot of the focus of applications in this round was transit service. Some of the new and enhanced bus services proposals, actually most of them, include complementary capital expenses like bus purchases, park and ride and bus stop improvements. One thing that we will need to watch for in future rounds is the overall share of program funding going to transit operations. We are limited per our MOA with the Commonwealth to 50% of our funding over any 5-year period. So with all of the round 1 projects we funded and all of the round 2 proposals, we would be close to that cap, still under it, but close to it. In terms of the breakdown between NVTC and PRTC, bit more of a total funding request among our jurisdictions and transit providers, a few more eligible proposals among PRTC's jurisdictions and transit providers. Next slide, please. Pivoting into evaluation, this slide shows the technical evaluation process adopted by the commissions last November. It puts most of the possible points, 70 of the 100, into how well proposed projects meet the corridor improvement goals of moving more people and creating viable, effective transportation options. That's what the technical merit criterion encompasses. The biggest single factor there, and therefore in our overall evaluation process, is person throughput. Here we're looking at the efficiency, looking at the number of additional people moved by the project in the peak period, peak direction, relative to the associated number of vehicle trips. Smaller categories are annualized cost effectiveness, basically the technical merit bang for the commuter choice funding buck, considering also the useful life of the project. Applicant preference, where each applicant picks their top priority project and receives 10 points for it. And then interagency collaboration, where proposals with documented support or collaboration from other regional entities can get 5 points in the process. Next slide, please. So here are the top level results. You also have a more detailed table with the meeting materials as an attachment. A couple remarks on the scoring results this time around. Actually, a general remark is that our person throughput factor and our cost effectiveness criterion are essentially graded on a curve, which is why when you look at the results, there are relatively similar numbers of proposals with full points, a few points, or somewhere in the middle. Also, for person throughput, we're looking at the opening year of each project. We always work with applicants to make sure that the figures are reasonable, as they will also be held to these as targets if we fund the projects. But this time, too, we look particularly close at impacts of COVID and how transit providers in particular expect ridership to rebound over the coming year or two. Another remark is our travel time savings factor. This is looking at the percentage of time saved for a typical commuter's trip from using the project relative to typically a non-tolled single occupancy vehicle drive trip. When the application period was open, the drive times were low due to impacts of COVID-19 on travel pattern changes, which is why most projects received no score for this factor. We do expect projects will deliver travel time benefits as traffic picks back up. And while there's a range of scores here, we think all these are strong candidates for funding. Qualitatively, they all support the corridor improvement goals well, and overall they would move about 1,000 more people inbound through the corridor each morning upon full implementation and as travel patterns revert to more typical conditions. Next slide, please. So the staff recommendation, as agreed by the Joint Commission Working Group last month, is indeed to fund all 13 eligible proposals, given their support for the corridor improvement goals and that they can fit within the funding expected to be available. We would be including our administrative costs for the 2-year period. That's $800,000 total, which would represent about 3.5% of the overall funding that would be awarded if the staff recommendation is adopted. Next slide, please. So in terms of what else is coming up, we've had public comment open since April 16th. We held a virtual town hall meeting last week on the 28th to provide further information on the program and proposals. The recording is available on our YouTube channel. If you want to see some must-see viewing, it is included. The link is included in the kit memo. This month, besides tonight's commission briefings, I will be soon commuting virtually over to PRTC to give them a very similar presentation. We will wrap up comments on the 17th and brief the CTB on the 18th. We will be sharing all the input we receive with you and the CTB before program adoption. So early next month, we'll seek both commission's adoption of a program of projects and its referral to the CTB for their action mid-month. And then once the CTB acts, distribution of project agreements so that implementation of the selected projects can begin with the start of the new fiscal year on July 1st. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Owen. Thank you for the extensive staff work that's been done. So let me open the floor for questions for Mr. Owen on these recommendations about 395.95, questions for Mr. Snyder on the Program Advisory Committee and the forthcoming recommendation he teed up for us about a supplemental funding round, and or questions for Ms. Mattice on behalf of Chairman McKay and the Joint Committee. Or was it possible that each presentation was so comprehensive we've been left with no possible questions? They've all been answered. Okay.
Madam Chair,
No.
this is Commissioner Turner, real quick. Just
Yeah, please.
on the Program Advisory Committee discussion, we talked about zero fares at length. There's a real opportunity here, which this conversation was mirrored again today when we were in a transit discussion with our transit team out here in Loudoun County. And of course, we've got a new transit provider, Keolis, and we're combining contracts. So we've got an opportunity to zero base a lot of stuff here. And the discussion was much the same as the Program Advisory Committee, that we probably need to discard the paradigm that we are going to return to normal. I don't think we're ever, and all of us, the consensus was we're not ever going to return to quote normal, unquote. There is a new normal out there and no one really knows what it is. And so we have the opportunity as we come back to that to slowly ramp up our services in the area of transit and figure out proper price points for ticketing, route structures, and a whole number of other things that it's a pretty rare opportunity to really, we kind of swept the slate clean, not obviously with any intention, and we certainly didn't want that, but it's happened. And now that it's happened, as we rebuild, we've got an opportunity to really measure those metrics or establish those metrics for what the new normal is going to look like. So it's just a lot of discussion around rebuilding back to whatever that new paradigm is and keeping an open mind about all that.
Well put. Thank you. All right. Others? A great question from Supervisor Turner. Any other commentary or queries? Okay. Hearing none, I need to take us a half step back in the agenda and go ahead and hear a motion to adopt approve our minutes from April's meeting, which I failed to do in my enthusiasm to get to the commuter choice program discussion. So this is a little bit earlier in our agenda. I ought to have called for a motion to approve the minutes of our March 4th, 2021 meeting. Do I have such a motion?
So moved.
Thank you. Is that Senator Evan?
Delegate Reed.
Great. I'll give it a second to Delegate Reed. Thank you both. Unless there is any discussion about those minutes from March. Hearing none, let's go ahead and have a roll call vote. Ms. Gilchrist, over to you.
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Gary.
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn,
Aye.
Mr. Bell,
Aye.
Ms. Bennett Parker,
Abstain?
Mr. DeFrank,
Aye.
Mr. Eben,
Aye.
Ms. Filler Corn,
Aye.
Mr. Faust, Ms. Garvey,
Aye.
Mr. Krizik,
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau,
Abstain?
Mr. Meyer, Ms. Pelchik,
Aye.
Mr. Reed,
Aye.
Mr. Smedberg,
Aye.
Mr. Snyder,
Aye.
Mr. Stork,
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan,
Aye.
Mr. Turner,
Aye.
and Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
Thank you. The motion passes. Turn it back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gilchrist. All right, thanks for bearing with the audible, everybody. So the next item on our agenda, similarly not for action yet, but teeing up for action. This is the general and administrative budget of the commission itself. So the funding for our excellent commission staff to do what they do and to support us in our work. As you all might remember, earlier in the year, we actually voted to delay the approval of this budget and work plan because there was so much uncertainty surrounding revenues, both the state revenues that help pay for NVTC and candidly our own budgets. Now that we have all, at least at the local level, limped our way out of the budget processes in each of our jurisdictions, I think some of those uncertainties have been clarified. And so we are gearing up to receive, or tonight we will receive, a more extensive presentation from Ms. Mattice and Mr. Qualcorf, who's our Director of Finance for the Commission, about the proposed administrative budget for our fiscal year 2022 to go into effect in July. Accompanying that has been our practice to take a look at the work plan for the year ahead as well, since those things really ought to be aligned. So again, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Mattice to tell us a little bit about the budget. It'll be before us for action, not this month, but next. Kate, over to you.
Indeed. Thank you, Madam Chair. And if we just go to the next slide, what I'll do is I'll just give an overview of the proposed approach, and then Scott's going to jump in and talk a little bit of background of both cost drivers as well as revenue, and then our proposed budget summary. Of course, all of this information is provided in your kit materials. As the chair mentioned, obviously there's been a lot of uncertainty. We're getting a much better sense of what's going on with revenues. And as Scott will show, in particular, our expected state revenues, which is a good share of the revenues that support NVTC's G&A budget, are actually looking in a very positive place for Northern Virginia. And so I did somewhat want to start with that. But very first and foremost, our focus this year was not to bloat. It was not to, introduce new initiatives or what have you, but was to make sure that we could cover the fixed cost obligations that we have as an organization, keep our strong staff, engaged. We have obviously a lot of regional things that we're working on. So that really was the impetus in the way that we approached our budget this year. It's obviously meeting the needs of the commission, of our mission, of the work plan that I'll mention a little bit later. But also, as Madam Chair had said, we did looking at, in terms of compensation, which is a part, a good part of our budget, is really what we do for our staff, making sure that we're roughly consistent with our peer agencies and with our jurisdictions. So that's pretty much the approach that we took within the budget. I'm going to turn this over to Scott to talk about, again, the drivers, the net revenues, and sort of where we are with the budget that we're presenting tonight. So next slide. Scott, ultimately.
Thank you, Kate. So NVTC's general administrative budget can be rolled up into four main cost categories: salaries and related payroll costs, rent, contracted services, and then other expenses. So not surprisingly, salaries make up most of NVTC's budget at almost 70%. Contracted services equal about 17%, and this includes consulting for the commuter choice program, legal support, HR, auditing, and state legislative services. The lease for NVTC's office space is 10% of our budget, with other expenses totaling around 5%. Next slide, please. So most of the funding for the G&A budget is from revenue taken off the top of state assistance that NVTC receives for its member jurisdictions. In fiscal year 21, NVTC will receive about $205 million in assistance, with less than 1.2% of that directed to the G&A budget. The local jurisdictions also provide direct contributions to NVTC from their budgets, and that equals about 8% of the G&A revenues. Commuter choice revenue makes up 26% of the total, and this funding is to support the direct costs in carrying out the program, including payroll, consulting services for technical and outreach efforts. And finally, a carryover of available surplus is included as a source of revenue. This carryover is the result of positive budget variances in prior years. So next slide, please. So looking at the revenue sources included in the proposed budget, direct contributions are held constant in total, but they do fluctuate by jurisdiction. And these amounts were provided to the jurisdictions this past fall for their internal budgeting purposes. Funding taken off the top of state aid is close to $2.4 million, but of note, it's expected that total assistance NVTC receives will increase about 13% over the 21 levels, which would be to $232 million. Interest and other revenues are estimated at $10,000, and the reimbursement of direct commuter choice program costs is budgeted at $960,000. NVTC also receives funding from VRE for staff support. And finally, the available carryover funding is shown at $100,000, which includes a positive budget variance from fiscal year 20 and also a portion of the budgeted fiscal year 21 surplus. Next slide, please. So this slide is a summary of the expenditures included in the full budget document, which is in the meeting materials. That document shows this information in greater detail and includes notes which explain each line item. But overall, the proposed budget shows an increase in total expenditures of $70,000 or 2% over the current fiscal year. Salaries and wages include a provision for COLA and merit increases. The increase in budget and other payroll costs, benefits and other payroll costs is due to an increase in health insurance premiums and payroll taxes, which is offset in part by a reduction in retirement costs. The increase in administrative costs is due mostly to office rent, which is based on the terms of our lease. And the decrease in contract services is attributable to the commuter choice program. I think I'll turn it back over to Kate, who will review the work plan, which is the next slide.
So indeed, as the chair said, we do really reflect upon the work that we're being asked to do and how our budget can support it. And so the work plan is considered, is included as part of your material. This is just a quick snapshot of all the different areas that we do. Obviously, there's a number of things that always come up during the middle of the year. We accommodate them as necessary. But in general, obviously we come and brief the commission on a number of these things. But again, what we're proposing in a budget will allow us to be successful in supporting the commission and successful in supporting the actions and deliverables that are associated with our work plan. And so I'm happy to pause here and take any questions. Again, we have a lot more information in your meeting materials, but these are some highlights.
Thanks so much, Ms. Matthijs. And Mr. Qualcoff, thank you too for the walkthrough of the operational budget. Let me do exactly that and open the floor for questions for either of our two staff leaders on the budget or on the work plan.
Madam Chair, this is Delegate Commissioner Krizak.
Please, hello.
I just wanted to ask regarding staff. How are we doing? Do we have any open positions? And what's our turnover rate? Is it maintaining? Is it staying strong? Or consistent, or has that been a problem?
So, Madam Chair and Delegate Krizak, I'm happy to report we actually have had a steady staffing for at least 2 years, which I think is just fantastic. We actually are going to be talking about the departure of one of our staff to go to graduate school a little bit later. But we do have a current vacancy, and so this budget does anticipate filling that. It's a vacancy in our financial management. We had actually had approval by the commission to fill that last year, but we decided during the pandemic and understanding quarantine, perhaps onboarding a new staff while we were remote might not be the best time, but we do plan on moving forward with that, and the budget does include that. But we've been very fortunate with staff really having a good tenure here within NVTC.
I gotta say, very fortunate is like a very passive verb. I think we are lucky to employ as executive director one of the best managers in Northern Virginia who has kept his staff in their positions during a time of a lot of transition. So it's a credit to the amazing team, and it's also a credit to the amazing team lead, I think.
Chair John Bell with a quick question.
Yes, please.
A lot of people have been working remote, and I know some employers have allowed people to stay remote, or they've had issues with people no longer wanting to come in as things change. Have you any thoughts or any impact that you could talk to on that, please?
Indeed, Madam Chair and Senator Bell, we've actually been surveying our employees, I think at least 2 times in the past year. We actually have another survey planned about getting sort of the sense of where staff are in interest. We do have some staff who have decided that they'd like to come back in a couple of days of the week. I'm one of them. And so we have made that possible. Our office space, we're very fortunate when we redid our office space a couple of years ago, we actually configured it in a way that each staff person actually has an individual workspace with a door, which I think has probably added some confidence in coming back. But we are not making our staff return. That's something we're working very closely with the staff on what that looks like. And I said, it's sort of real time because we're actually planning on doing an employee survey within the next couple of weeks to gauge what that looks like, especially going into the summer and into the fall.
Thank you. Great questions, both. Any other questions? What staff operations, the budget?
This is Commissioner Turner. Hey, just really quickly, a 9% increase in health insurance costs. Is there something going on in the health insurance industry? That seems ridiculously high.
Maybe one for Mr. Clark.
No, there is not a 9% increase in health insurance. Perhaps I misspoke. I believe there is an increase in benefits and other payroll costs that's due to an increase in health insurance premiums. But that's not 9%. I think our health insurance premiums increased roughly 4% for the coming year.
Okay. It just was a number that just jumped out at me. I'm just curious what made it up.
And if I could, Mr. Turner, on that chart, the insurance, and there's actually more details within the document. I believe the insurance line that you're looking at is actually a fairly small dollar value that went up. And so I can't recall which specific insurance that is. So the percentage looks high, but it's going from something like $6,500 to $7,500. So overall magnitude of that line item, it goes up 9%. But overall, it's actually a small dollar value. We do get that in some of our categories.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks for clarifying, though, and for taking an eagle eye to the budget. Anyone else? Okay. Well, hearing none, if you think of any burning questions, I'll have another opportunity to ask them when we vote again at our June meeting, or vote for the first time, hear it again at our June meeting. And again, Kate and Scott, thank you both so much for the presentation. Okay, turning to WMATA, certainly a lot afoot between the COVID response, budget updates, other news, return of service in the evenings on buses, which is very exciting. So lots afoot. We're fortunate to have both Mr. Smedberg, the Commonwealth's appointee and the Metro Board Chair, and Mr. Letourneau, our appointee, and one of the 2 Virginia members with us tonight. So I'll turn it to you both and whomever would like to be our lead-off hitter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, everyone. So in April, the WMATA board adopted the fiscal year 22 budget and the fiscal year 2022 and 2027 capital improvement program. The adopted fiscal year 22 operating budget reflects $193 million in federal relief from the American Rescue Plan Act that was enacted in March. Because of the additional federal funding, we were able to avoid service reductions, station closures, and layoffs. Metro Rail will continue to operate at 85% of pre-pandemic service levels, and Metro Bus will operate at 85% of pre-pandemic service levels. The fiscal year 22 operating budget also includes funding for a start of service at the Potomac Yard Station, a revenue service date of January 2022 for the Silver Line Phase 2. Although Matt and I want to note here, and this is an important note, that WMATA will not set a target service date until MWA resolves all the identified remaining issues related to the Silver Line Phase 2. And I'm sure you're all aware of those issues that MWA, its contractors, and WMATA staff are working through. And finally, $20 million in equity initiatives and Title VI mitigation for the Silver Line Phase 2. In regard to the capital budget, the fiscal year 22 capital budget totals $2.6 billion, of which approximately $1 billion is funded through dedicated capital funding debt. This is the largest capital budget in recent memory, and this acceleration of capital expenditures would not be possible without the dedicated funding provided by the region. The WMATA capital budget and CIP prioritize state of good repair improvements, customer safety, and service reliability. WMATA will continue to monitor ridership and reopening trends in the region, and will keep the WMATA board informed and this commission informed on the ongoing basis so that service can be adjusted as needed. Also want people to know myself and the general manager and other members of Mr. Wiedefeld's team have been meeting with business leaders from around the region and various groups to talk about how and when people are going to be coming back to work and to the office. Obviously, we want to get people back on transit and on buses and rail and not in their cars. It will obviously be a very new environment, paradigm of how people work moving forward, but we're trying to get a good sense of that. We've also been talking obviously to the federal government, OPM and Defense Department and other agencies. So that's ongoing work. And one last thing, I've been working with the General Counsel and Regina Sullivan, who many of you know through the JCC work. Regina heads up government affairs for WMATA. We've been working primarily with Senator Warner's office and Congressman Conley's office on PREA reauthorization. So we've been doing a lot of work in that area because that's a very important piece for us, and how that plays out over the next several weeks and months with infrastructure and other things that the Congress is considering. We'll see how it plays out, but we are pushing for the reauthorization of our PREA funding, which is about $150 million annually, and that's obviously very important to us. So, and now I'll turn it over to Mr. Letourneau.
Yeah.
Matt.
Good evening, everybody. Just the one thing I'll add on the capital budget that we are looking at is when you project out, we start running out of that dedicated revenue around 2027 and 2028, which then creates a very sizable funding hole. We will not be complete on all of our state of good repair work at that point. So we have begun discussions about sort of the regional conversation that will need to take place. I know that's 6 or 7 years from now, but you all know the amount of effort it took last time around when we had a funding crunch. And, we want to make sure people realize that the funding that was made available last time will eventually run out. And so it is not a true reoccurring funding source. So, similar to what other transit agencies have around the country. So that will become an issue again down the road for us. But in the meantime, we believe that it was the directive of the General Assembly and Maryland and DC to spend this money as quickly as we can to get the system up to a state of good repair. And so that is how the money is being applied project by project across the system. As far as bringing ridership back, you may have seen some stories, including one in the Post, about different conversations underway in the Metro Board level to bring back riders and fare policy. One of our colleagues sort of had a brainstorm out loud with some ideas on how to do that, including the notion of potentially having a short-term discount that may be brought, phased out as ridership continues. I want to emphasize that that was just his brainstorming at that moment and not a board decision at this point. But we are having discussions about fare policy in general. It's something that this body has talked about quite a bit, and I think we had really had some good ideas prior to the pandemic, and then when the pandemic hit, some of those things it was difficult to really gain traction on. But I know that as a Metro board, we're having these discussions, and it's something that came out of our retreat, and then our Metro committee and Chair Gary is also going to be leading some of these discussions in the Metro committee, so that NVTC can sort of feed into what that discussion is and some of the different options that are available to us. We do have an opportunity here with ridership and revenue being so low to sort of re-examine the fare structure and whether it makes sense, whether the notion of, what is peak fare, for instance, whether that makes sense in today's world. The last thing that I'm going to mention is a topic that has come up recently, including at NVTA, and that is the traction power upgrade program. There's been some back and forth on this issue, and I'm not going to sort of go chapter and verse in great history on it right now. But I just wanted to make a couple of comments because I know that NVTA did have concerns about it. And for those who are on the authority, you know what I'm talking about. For those that aren't, this is a project to upgrade traction power on the orange and blue line. The purpose of that is to ultimately be able to increase capacity and bring 8-car trains. Right now, we could not add any more trains on those lines because there's simply not enough power there. So this was actually a FY 2014 project, to give you some history. And NVTA had a SPA, a project agreement with Metro to undertake this work. So Metro did so, which involved letting out contracts and bringing in construction crews and undertaking the work. Both projects are now finished. Metro did incur the expenses and then began invoicing for those with all of our jurisdictions. Not only Virginia paid for this, we do everything as a system. So DC and Maryland also paid. DC and Maryland promptly paid their bill, but we were having some difficulty with NVTA paying its share of the project, and NVTA had some concerns about whether the project qualified under the particular criteria that they have. Our perspective on this was that all of those issues were very thoroughly vetted when there was an original project agreement. None of the circumstances around the project changed at any point. And so the appropriate time to address those concerns would have been when the SPA was first put together, not after Metro has already undertaken the expense. The bottom line for Metro is that this was an expense for us. We get all of our money from all of you. So one way or the other, Virginia has to pay its portion of the project. Metro began invoicing, as I said, and then around 2018, the invoices were not paid. And so a conversation has ensued. It seems like we have reached now a place where NVTA is going to be moving forward with paying, which is good news because it means that all of us jurisdictions will not have to pay. But I know that NVTA, continues to have concerns with some of the communications that have taken place. There were a great deal of staff conversation between WMATA staff and NVTA, and I have kind of the chapter and verse on all of those conversations. So I do think that perhaps the impression that was given at the authority was that there was not a dialogue when in fact there was. But more importantly, I think for Paul and myself, we are Metro. Metro does things sometimes that we don't ourselves always agree with or sometimes take issue with, and we do our best in our governor's positions to try to deal with those. But in this case, anytime that there are concerns, please bring them to us. We are your representatives. We represent all the jurisdictions. Paul represents the Commonwealth. And, certainly had we been asked to appear at an authority meeting and discuss this, we would have been happy to. I did at one point try to facilitate a discussion between some of the principals and staff, which I thought at the time was productive. But, I know that some authority members and from the conversation that took place at a public meeting still have questions about this. And so please come to us with those questions and we can help walk you through all the details and what Metro did and didn't do. And because, I expect to be held accountable, certainly, and I know Paul does as well. But, we want to facilitate as open and transparent communication as we possibly can. And sometimes it's hard for us even with Metro, but in this case, we're pretty well up to speed on this particular project, and it's something that we were really eager to see happen so that we could potentially increase capacity. Not just potentially, we will increase capacity down the road. And this is a critical step to having that happen. So I will end on that, and I know both of us are happy to take questions.
Madam Chair, if I could, thank you. Two other quick things. First, I want to amplify something Matt just said about the whole discussion about fares and fare structure and everything. And in fact, I was just talking to Mr. Wiedefeld this afternoon. We are going to do that in a very thoughtful, responsible, fiscally responsible way. We just cannot make these decisions off the cuff, in one meeting. And unfortunately, there was some expectation that was set by that one speech by one of the board members. But we very much need this commission's input and the region's input on this as we move forward. And, we're going to turn to you for, some of that help there. And then lastly, the Metro Board had a retreat a few weeks ago. I just wanted to let people know that. I thought it was personally thought it was a very productive session. I think we came up with a good outline and a way to move forward on a lot of these key issues and assigning ownership to various topics and, setting up a good framework in which to engage staff and the region on a lot of these issues. So just wanted to let people know that. And you'll probably be hearing more about that as some of these bigger issues come forward for debate.
Thank you, Mr. Smedberg. Thank you both. Certainly a variety of topics, and I'm happy to open the floor to questions or comments either on the ones that were raised by our Metro Board representatives thus far in their presentations, or any other concerns or questions about WMATA, Metro return to service, et cetera, that may be on commissioners' minds. I see Ms. Garvey's hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Crystal. I really appreciate the report, and thank you for filling us in a little bit about the NVTA issue with which I was not familiar. And I appreciate your work and your offer to talk to us. I think it's always hard when you kind of get surprised. But what I wanted to just ask you about a little bit, at the Region Forward meeting we had just a little bit ago, a week ago, we looked at transportation and the future, and they talked about, the speakers talked about a survey with which I suspect you all are more familiar than I am. And I'm looking at my notes. I didn't write down who did the survey, but there were a couple of interesting things. One was they were asking people about going back, and apparently 65% of the people doing have done transit that they got to respond. So they wanted to do both teleworking and in person. So they wanted to do a hybrid model. Only 26% said they wanted to telework full time, and only 9% said they want to do in-person full time, which kind of yields that everybody's kind of liking this blend. And the other, I'm going to get to the main point. The other data point that struck me, which they said, was that about 1 out of 5 trips are not work related on transit. So people are starting to take transit, and maybe it's just during the pandemic for a lot of different reasons, which leads me to the question I think, Paul, you mentioned that everybody's looking at is, do we want to get out of the peak time, rides? And what both of these data points show, say to me, and I'd love just your reaction and any thought about it, is that probably transit needs to just simply be reliable and kind of steady, rather than you can get a great ride if you're leaving at 5 or coming in at 8, but otherwise you're stuck. And so I assume that's the direction you're going. So anything you'd like to say about that? And I'm sorry, this is probably too long a question maybe for our crammed meeting, but I was fascinated after the Region Forward meeting.
Yeah, there are a lot of studies going around, Libby, and that is pretty much in line with, I think, what we're hearing from folks. And in regard to peak, non-peak, I think all of that is going to be up for debate. I mean, there's going to be a lot on the table. I think ultimately, our fare structure and potentially the fares themselves are going to look very, very different. I don't think people think that this system we have now in place is going to be sustainable into the future, particularly if we want to capture people using transit outside of just getting back and forth to work. And, the surveys we conducted, you see it, particularly younger folks, where they're locating in and around Metro, choosing to live in and around Metro, whether they have a car or if they have a car, it's only one car maybe per family or per couple. And people are beginning to look at transit very differently. A lot of people were using the bus because there weren't cars on the road and it was a much quicker way to get to where they had to go. A lot of them were essential workers early on, or people who are transit dependent, but then there were others that were simply using it to go somewhere. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how this all sort of plays out over the next couple of years, because I think it's going to be a big change for us, for sure.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I'll just toss out, Madam Chair, I mean, maybe down the road, we could have a meeting that kind of focuses a little bit. I think we need to get more information, and I assume we'll probably do that. But this to me is fascinating because I think it really is. I think transit is changing and probably becoming what it should have been maybe all along, I hope. So thank you. Thanks.
That's also such an interesting insight that riders were choosing buses because the buses weren't competing with cars.
There were no cars on the road. They were,
And which says a lot about some of the efforts for dedicated, bus signal priority and lanes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Technology, and how the local systems in Metro share and connect and make it seamless for folks to go from rail to bus or bus to rail or bus to bus, whatever it is. That's another piece of this debate.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from a lot of representatives? Okay.
John Bell, quick question.
Yes, please, Senator Bell.
Yeah. First comment. Thanks for the briefing, both of you, and Matt, welcome back. I hope your recovery is going well. Good to have you back with us. The question I've got is about the discounting. I'm not really, for or against it. I mean, it could be a good idea. I guess my input would be, I hope that they would do analysis on what impact that could possibly have, and then also put some definite time frames on how long it would last, because I think, judging the financial impact, we need to see if it's getting the desired effect and how long it would last and what other impacts it possibly could have. Thank you.
John, are you talking about, Senator Bell, are you talking about a short-term discount that I mentioned? I think.
Yes, if you heard me, the short-term.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, the one thought that some of us had on that, just in my experience in government now over 10 years, is when one provides something, it becomes difficult to take that thing away, even if it was supposed to be temporary. So I think, and I don't want to speak for Paul, but I think the two of us have kind of preferred an approach here that, would be more of a fair reset that is lasting, as opposed to just sort of throwing some short-term things at the wall. Because we think, over the summer and as we get to Labor Day, there naturally will be people coming back. At some, whether it's, certainly not going to be everybody, but whatever percentage that is, I think we do expect ridership will increase, especially around Labor Day in the district area when a lot of employers are going to be bringing at least some folks back. So that's going to happen. But I think, we're really interested in things that may just make more sense as an overall reset, as opposed to just a short-term, get people back on transit type of thing, because circumstances change and we want to sort of be ready for what the next thing is.
Yeah, and Matt, that's a good point, because these decisions are going to have to be financially sustainable and are going to have huge impacts for the foreseeable future. And again, we just can't do it in one meeting like some folks wanted, because the implications are pretty significant.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I guess, Matt, I share your concern about once you set a price, it's hard to get off of that. People have a long memory of things like that. I mean, and I agree with you, Paul, about the impact that could be significant. I would say if it doesn't bounce back, maybe, I'd be more in favor of considering something like you buy 4 rides, get the 5th one free or something like that, and maintain the pricing. So then you're not resetting that. But I agree, it's probably better to look at it in terms of a broader approach than just a short-term approach. Thank you.
Yeah, not to play the naysayer, this is Commissioner Turner. I disagree with that approach. Just we can talk about it offline. I think we can be too clever by half and really stretch out people getting back on Metro. I fully agree and concur with the deliberate analysis. I just think that I don't know, marketing uses loss leaders all the time to change habit patterns. So obviously, everybody's involved is pretty sharp thinker on this one. So I'll defer to that judgment. But the notion of setting fares one time based on a new normal and going from there, I just don't buy that one.
Government doesn't typically do loss leaders, though. I take your point, Mike, and we can certainly talk more. Thanks for the discussion.
Could I ask just a quick question? Speaking of fairs and government, I know a couple years ago we were, as part of our federal lobbying activities, really concerned about and lobbying hard for the preservation of the federal employee transit benefit. Do we know how, if at all, that has changed with so much of the federal government shifting to telework during the pandemic? I mean, is that transit benefit still available for federal employees who are still coming to work? Is there any talk of changing that with potential federal agencies working on hybrid? Have you all heard anything about that at Metro? I know that's actually been a huge source of revenue for Metro.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you know, Matt? Andrew, do you know?
I assume it's still, it's still available.
It's still in place. I know that. Yeah, it hasn't been taken away.
I think it's one of the ways that we've been tracking how many federal employees have actually been using the system. Yeah. But no, I haven't heard anything specifically about that.
But Madam Chair, there are initiatives underway. I think the state of Maryland just recently announced, or some people are talking about the possibility of giving folks $100 a month or have some sort of payment. I know the district is looking at something like that if they're not close to passing something like that already that people could use for transit. So there are some local proposals out there to get people back on transit as opposed to getting in their cars, but I'm not sure where a lot of that is right now. So,
okay. Yeah. Thank you. All right.
So,
is there another question out there?
Yes. So, Madam Chair, just a quick question on I'm looking through the materials and listening to the conversation. I didn't know if either of you wanted to or might be able to kind of handicap or describe the scale of the fiscal challenge we're looking at for fiscal 23. Briefly, I know we have a heavy agenda, but we talked a lot about fares and sustainability. Is it a 20%, 30%, or is it just still premature based on all the questions about returning to ridership?
I mean, the ridership question is huge, and the challenges are not going to go in 23.
Yeah.
But
that's
on
the
the
answer.
Flip side, the amount of federal assistance that we are receiving will not be all used in 22. We will have remainder available to us in 23, provided that we don't really go aggressive on the fare discussion, because all of that requires subsidy. So I mean that actually factors in, and I'm actually glad you brought it up, because I mean the Metro Board could do all kinds of things to bring ridership back, but they all have an impact on our budget. And so I think the general manager's inclination is to make sure that we do have funding available in 23 to address a shortfall that will likely still be there because ridership hasn't fully come back to its levels. It's difficult to handicap, what Congress will do. Congress has been very, very generous to transit over the last, year, and we've received, really 3 different rounds of funding. We can't bank on that happening again, in another year. So I think the idea will be to ensure that we do have some of that available to plug whatever hole does exist. And there are, we do have some they've shown us some fiscal projections with ridership and expenditures and all that go out that far, just so we have an idea of what we're looking at. But I think it's such uncharted territory. It's hard to say exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to be a challenge, Matt. And every indication we're getting, I think getting another tranche of money for transit it's going to be very difficult. I doubt it'll happen. So we've got to, as Matt said, there is a little left over, but the challenge is still going to be there for sure.
It's helpful. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, if I could, got confirmation there has been no change to the federal transit benefit. So still all in place, 200 and whatever it is.
Yeah. But that doesn't, this is probably a very inexpert question, but I'm thinking about it from the lens of VRE, where oftentimes if that benefit will take the form of a monthly pass that the riders purchase, and then hopefully VRE actually gets that revenue, whether the riders take the individual trips or not. That's not how it works with the Metro passes, is it? I mean, that's not, for example, a source of revenue that Metro is getting whether the federal employees actually ride or not. They need to take each ride for Metro to see the results of that federal benefit.
I believe that's how it works. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all. We'll move on. Certainly a huge body of work focusing on some very near-term decisions and some slightly longer-term decisions at the same time. And we appreciate you, as always, serving the Northern Virginia interests and the region's interests on the WMATA board. Speaking of our generous friends across the river, which is fun to say and not something we had been saying very, very often recently, we do have a federal legislative update, and I'd like to welcome in particular Zach Smith from the commission staff to give us a presentation there. Oh, forgive me. Oh my goodness, Mr. Vice Chair, we have an opportunity for a report from the WMATA committee, which also has been working very hard. And so I'd like to invite Mr. Aguirre to talk a little bit about the WMATA committee.
I know we're a little WMATa'd out, but I'll be very brief, Madam Chair. Thank you. So our next meeting is going to be May 20th. We have a very, very full agenda. We plan to cover the 2021 report on the annual performance and condition of WMATA, where we'll focus on strategies to rebuild ridership, as we've already kind of mentioned here. We also plan to receive brief updates from staff on the scope of the 3% cap working group's work for 2021, as well as a few other items. I'll also be working with staff and our WMATA board members on the timing and structure of Mr. Letourneau's request for ideas on potential fare policy changes to rebuild ridership, as we've already clearly been discussing. So probably going to be a very robust conversation, and as always, all are welcome to join us. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Excellent. Thanks. And I'm so glad to hear that we'll be using the committee as a forum to discuss exactly that question about what we think from our constituents and riders about the evolving fare policies or products. Okay, great. Now I'm serious. To you, Zach, Mr. Smith, over to you for a federal legislative update. And does this mean we can now start making Mr. Smith Goes to Washington jokes? If you'll be leading up our federal legislative program.
I think it does. You're right, Madam Chair. Usually there's not much to say about the transportation space on Capitol Hill, but this has been one of the more exciting years for transportation in DC. So as you know, back in March, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, which provided $30.5 billion for public transit, and which is great news because it helped WMATA avoid those severe service cuts and changes for the next fiscal year. But there's still quite a few different transportation proposals and legislation out there, so I'll just touch on a few measures tonight. The American Jobs Plan, which is President Biden's infrastructure plan. The next Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, also known as the FAST Act, and then I'll speak a bit about the FY22 appropriations process. So with the American Jobs Plan, President Biden is focused on passing his infrastructure bill that is intended to rebuild the nation's infrastructure, make investments in clean energy and electric vehicles, and expand transit into new communities. He's put forth his $2.3 trillion infrastructure proposal that will last over 8 years. And Specifically, the plan would provide about $85 billion to modernize and expand existing public transportation and $80 billion for passenger and freight rail service. It also includes about $25 billion for zero emission vehicles as well. Just some other notes on his infrastructure plan. There would also be a program for large projects that benefit a regional or national economy, and a new program that provides transportation accessibility for disadvantaged areas. I think one thing to note about President Biden's plan is that it is still a plan. There hasn't been any legislative text yet, so it's a little bit unclear about what type of program or grant program or formula discretionary that funding would attach to. And so last week, Senate Republicans countered President Biden's plan with a $568 billion proposal of their own, which would see $299 billion going to roadways and about $61 billion going to public transit over a 5-year period. I think a key difference to note between the two different versions of the infrastructure proposals is that President Biden's plan is mostly new spending for transit, whereas the Republican proposal includes existing spending and current formula discretionary grant programs. And also, I think this has been making its way around the news that President Biden has said he would raise the corporate tax rate to pay for his infrastructure plan. It's a little unclear how the Republicans plan to pay for their version of the plan, but they said they would not increase the debt to do it, and they would call for repurposing federal funds to cover their proposal. And so now that we do have a Republican proposal, there are sort of two paths forward for an infrastructure bill, either the bipartisan pathway that would require the 60 votes in the Senate to pass, or Democrats could use the budget reconciliation process with a small majority to pass it like they did with the last COVID-19 bill. And I think Speaker Pelosi has indicated that July 4th would be the time period for when she wants to see a bill hit the floor. And so with the FAST Act expiring on September 30th, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has asked House members to submit policy recommendations and earmarks for community infrastructure project proposals that would be included in the next surface transportation bill. You'll see in your packet that NVTC did submit a letter of support for our Envision Route 7 project, as well as support for local transportation projects throughout the region. And on the House side, leadership of the T&I committee hopes to mark up their bill later this month. On the other chamber, the 3 Senate committees with jurisdiction over transportation and spending have not set a date for when they would advance the bill to the floor. Although last summer the House did pass H.R. 2, or the Invest in America Act, before it was granted a 1-year extension until the end of this September. It did include $105 billion for public transit over 5 years, $60 billion for passenger rail, and it restored 20% of the bus capital grant program. However, it was ultimately stalled in the Senate, but it does give us a little bit of insight into what the House T&I committee members are thinking and what they could possibly put forth again. And just a final point on the appropriations process. Last month, the president sent his discretionary spending priorities to Congress for FY22. For transportation, the president proposes $2.5 billion for the Capital Investment Grant Program, $250 million for low and no emission bus program, and $110 million for a new program to support transportation equity. And right now, the appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate are working on their own proposals and awaiting the president's full FY22 budget, which would give them a better picture of funding levels that he proposes. And this year, the House Appropriations Committee also took requests for transportation projects or earmarks for FY22. And we expect that the Senate Appropriations Committee will begin a process of their own on earmarks as well. And just one other thing to note, on Tuesday, Senator Schumer and Senator Brown released the Clean Transit for America proposal, which would provide about $73 billion to transition to zero-emission vehicles for the bus fleet. And with that, I will take any questions.
Kidding. That is a lot of activity. And thank you in particular for that heads up that the Senate may be engaging in a parallel earmark process. I wonder if that might be an opportunity for us to coordinate amongst ourselves even more so than we did on the House side, particularly because those of us in Northern Virginia share our senators as opposed to working a few different angles of House member staff. Great. So questions for Mr. Smith or other members of our commission staff on this rapidly changing federal space?
I just have one quick question that Mr. Smith, that you could, or others on the call may know, that you can either answer now or get back to us, but someone shared with me that they think that reconciliation is not a tool that is available until June. And so I just was curious if that certainly would have an impact on why I don't see quite the speed that we saw with the American Rescue Plan. But I don't know if that's something you know or might be able to get back to us.
Right. I haven't heard anything specific on the timing or when they could use budget reconciliation, but I could definitely look into that for you.
Great. Thanks.
Madam Chair.
Please, Mr. Krizik.
Mr. Smith, can you explain to us a little bit about how the new the earmark process is working now? I understand it's much more structured and formalized than it used to be. If you know the answer to that now, or we can get that later from you.
I might punt that one over to Kate to see if she can help out with that one.
Absolutely, I'm happy to. And I think first of all, so we've had the ability to engage with Congresswoman Wexton's office, Congressman Byers' office, and Congressman Connolly's office. Just full disclosure, hearing from those staff, the earmark process on the House side happened fast, happened furious, and really was, I think everybody was learning at the same time. And I do know that they, each of those offices reached out to specific jurisdictions to hear about it. What appears to have happened, again, it's been almost a dozen years since we've seen earmarks in Congress. Each office had a little bit different approach, but most of them did involve sort of filling a form of information on the transportation side of things, specifically asking about where a project is in its planning, in a sense of sort of that perhaps there's a little bit more vetting of what that project looks like than may have happened in the past. But I think we're going to just sort of see how that plays out. The other thing that I've heard somewhat anecdotally is that the dollar value of the earmark requests that were being solicited was probably considerably smaller than we may have seen 10, 12 years ago. They were more like $1 million versus, somebody looking for $20 or $30 million. And just to follow up, as Zach had mentioned, we are now hearing about the Senate side. In fact, I heard something this morning. And so obviously our engagement on the Senate side, it may be a little bit different process, but again, I think coming educated on what those projects are, where they sit in plans, what the cost estimate are, who all has endorsed them, which I think was a very difficult thing to do in a 3-week turnaround, was to get endorsement letters. We don't even have bodies that meet that quickly. But the other side of it is if this is what's going to happen each year, we can learn a little bit from this year and be more prepared moving forward to understand that process.
I also understand that the earmarks would be about 1% of the respective budgets. Let's say the transportation budget would be 1% of it would be earmarks. And it was the localities that had to request those earmarks as well. Yeah, and you guys, congratulations, everybody, Alexandria, everybody, Arlington that did that. Thank you.
When there's money on the table, we'll scramble, right? Great. Good questions. Any others for Mr. Smith?
Sure. Madam Chair, Dave Snyder, just
yeah, please.
Thanks for the NVTC letter that went in that was mentioned. Have we received any reaction, and is there any follow-up that NVTC plans with regard to its letter and the projects listed? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, Madam Chair, Mr. Snyder. So indeed, there was obviously, we had referenced individual projects that jurisdictions had submitted. So I don't have specific details on what the other jurisdictional projects. The feedback we did get on our Route 7 is, again, it's probably lessons learned for the future. We were looking for planning money. And we have a project, the Route 7 Bus Rapid Transit Project, crosses 4 jurisdictions. Really, why NVTC is helping move that forward. I think most of the initial calls, the initial earmarks were to specific jurisdictions. And so I think a lesson moving forward is how we can ensure that the members of Congress also look to the regional bodies who may have something that crosses over 4 jurisdictions. And so I do think there's opportunities moving forward. We're going to talk a little bit about Route 7. We do have some state funding that we're planning now, but we actually have our eyes on potentially a discretionary grant program that's now called the RAISE program at USDOT, perhaps for next year, to really do a concerted effort towards that funding, or maybe an earmark. But in terms of at least the NVTC request, we did get a couple of thank you, we love this project, but this is not the year for you. So.
Thank you. All right. Just looking for any hands or comments. Anyone we haven't gotten to yet on this? Okay. Well, Mr. Smith, thank you. It's been a busy time to cover this bailiwick within the commission, and we appreciate your work.
Well, thank you.
And speaking of other bailiwicks within NVTC, our Transit Resource Center, which is always a great source of analysis and data for us about how transit's performing in the region, has a presentation for us tonight about current trends. The crystal ball we're always asking for, or at least to look at a snapshot maybe is the more apt metaphor. So let me turn it over to Kate, or Ms. Mattice will then introduce Mr. Goldfarb.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And in fact, part of the context I wanted to give was Dan's going to talk ever so briefly about our Envision Route 7 BRT. But obviously I just put that out there. We are continuing to move that project forward. And he's going to talk about where we are in phases for that and the possibility of looking for future funding. But the other thing Dan's going to really show us is really some of this data trends. I think it's some really interesting things. This is obviously something we've been watching very closely. So I'm happy to turn over to Dan for sort of the rest of the slide deck here. And Dan's been working with us for a number of years, and he is really our technical whiz. He's our modeling and our data analysis lead for that Transit Resource Center. So Dan, it's all yours.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Good evening, everyone. I'll just walk us through this real quick. First thing, just a reminder, what is the Transit Resource Center? To give you a reminder and what we're doing at the Transit Resource Center is we kind of have 4 areas that we work in space. And one thing is the National Transit Database. We have a contract that we oversee that helps our jurisdictions fill out the data needed for this FTA program. And to give you an idea, on average, the contract value is about $225,000. And in the last fiscal year, we had $10 million worth of FTA money that came back to the region that then is applied to the Metro bill, is an easy way to say it. So it's really a worthwhile effort that we do, and we've continued to do it for some years now. The second area that I think is really interesting is we have a service planning forecasting tool, service planning tool that we use called TBEST, and Matt Chang has been doing the lion's share of that work. And besides being a really rich database for the region in terms of socioeconomic data and also transit data, and being able to do the short-term forecasting, we've helped some of our jurisdictions with their studies. We've helped Alexandria, and most recently we've been helping Fairfax County a great deal, and we're soon going to help the city of Fairfax. And what we do is we just provide the service of doing that forecasting, which then frees up other resources within the jurisdiction to put into that planning effort of the study. So we really view it as we're complementary to the effort. We just do the forecasting and supply the data that helps our jurisdictions make better decisions. The second or the third area really is we compile every quarter transit ridership data, and we're starting to put that out in different formats that'll be hopefully a little bit more useful to the residents of the region, as well as the commissioners and any staff at the jurisdictions. And then we do kind of special studies and research. And to give you an example of that is a few years back, we did the value of Metro in Northern Virginia. Last year, we kind of looked at some COVID telework impacts and how that played out in different scenarios. And we've looked at measures of effectiveness to help commuter choice when questions have come up with that. But special studies, really Envision Route 7 is a big special study we're doing. And next slide, please. So what Envision Route 7 is it was started as looking at what transit options would serve the Route 7 corridor best. And BRT is really the best option for the corridor. It came out of studies, but it connects Tysons and Alexandria and all along the corridor and feeds into, touches on 4 jurisdictions, connecting a major connection with Metro at the East Falls Church Metro Station. And I just, what are some of the benefits? It reduces transit travel time in the corridor by 50%. And when we look at forecasting for year 2040, 2045, we're attracting 7,000 new riders to transit in the corridor. And of that 7,000, what's really interesting is that 2/3 of them are non-work trips. They're going for recreational or shopping. And usually that isn't the market that transit reaches. When we do these studies, we usually are focused really on commuter trips. And this is such a rich corridor, and that's what it's kind of showing here. And one thing we like to talk about too, which was that in terms of active transportation, which is getting people out walking and moving, because there's a BRT, instead of people getting in their car, they'll walk to catch the BRT, right? And they'll walk when they get off. So we saw a 20% increase in walk access to transit with the BRT when we looked at it too. And that really leads into healthy communities, which is an important goal, I think. So next slide, please. So Route 7 is a great project. And the question always is, well, where are you on Route 7? So phase 1 started in 2013 before I got to the commission. And that went through into phase 2. Phase 1 just looked at what is feasible. Phase 2 then really dove down and looked at termini, alignment, and mode. And that ended in 2017. And then in the following that, we did a conceptual design study, which quickly looked at, what's the 10% design of the corridor, and where do we need to start looking into areas that we should be looking for if we have the opportunity to get right of way, et cetera, et cetera. And that leads us to phase 4, which is our mobility study, which is coming up hopefully this year. And I think next month we'll be coming to the commission to ask permission to put out an RFP for our phase 4 study. And that's going to take the work that Fairfax County did in Tysons and add on to it through the City of Falls Church to 7 Corners. And what we're really looking at is we're doing a micro simulation of the corridor to look at the impacts and the benefits. And we're really bringing it down to that really disaggregated level of how do we benefit people in the corridor and what will they see from these benefits. So we hope to have that. That'll kick off hopefully this fall. That'll go about 1.5 to 2 years. Then we'll do the second part of the corridor, which is, or the last third from 7 Corners down to Alexandria. And then after that, we'll go into the environmental assessment, design, construction. And so you can see we have 7 phases in our Envision Route 7 project that we hope to complete in the long term. Okay, next slide, please. So that was kind of an overview of where we are with Route 7 and the total, what we do at the Transit Resource Center. But now I want to kind of talk about some data and research, which I think is interesting for everyone. Again, I think it was mentioned earlier in the meeting, there's a lot of surveys out there. There's a lot of data points out there. So this is just one snapshot that describes what we're seeing with transit. Next slide, please. So what's really driving the transit ridership or lack of ridership is really the percent of telework. I mean, there's lots of different trip purposes, but commuting has the largest impact on our transportation networks. If we think about all the other trips we do, the average trip length is 5 miles or less, but our commuting trips tend to be an average trip length of of 15, and if you go to the outer jurisdictions, 20 miles up to 20 miles. So even though it's only one purpose in the day that we take a trip, it certainly has a large impact on our whole network. And it's driven by a lot in this drop we've seen in travel across all modes is really driven by the amount of telework we're seeing. And if we look at this chart, I think District of Columbia, because it's at a statewide level, that was the data source. They used probe data to develop this. We can look at District of Columbia as kind of a snapshot for the whole region, especially the inner suburbs for the most part. And I think what's important to see is that compared to the bordering states, Maryland and Virginia, and nationwide, the District of Columbia has the slowest decrease in percent telework at this time. And I think that's a function of the jobs, right? We have a lot of jobs in this region that you can telework with. So I think that as we see teleworking, as we see the percent of people staying home working, people going back to the office, as that decreases, we'll see a rise in travel demand. Next slide, please. But as when we had these impacts from the, whoops, one slide too many. Yay, there we are. Okay, thank you. As we look back on 2020, what happened in 2020 to transit? If we look at the first part of the year and we compare it to the year before, there was a 44% drop in transit. So that kind of hides the story that when we dig down into the months of April and May, we see a large drop in transit ridership because we had the stay-at-home work orders and people were teleworking, where you had an 88% drop in transit in Northern Virginia. And in bus, that was about 80% drop. And then rail, the two rail modes, which are more commuter dependent, had greater than 95% drops in ridership. So it really was traumatic, and the drop there. It was shocking to see. So next slide, please. So if we look at it kind of as a time series, we started off the year really well. We had more ridership because the previous year was a government shutdown. And I think probably when we talked about the first quarter of 2020, numbers were looking good, right? As we looked at those numbers. And then the pandemic hit and you see that ski slope drop there. It's like a black diamond ski slope as it goes down. But as we look towards the end of the year, we can see that it's slowly starting to increase. Now this is all modes. So I want to go to the next slide, please, where we look at bus. Now, bus didn't have the huge drops as we talked about as rail did. And that's because bus serves different markets. Bus also serves the transit dependent. Bus is a cheaper mode. Bus goes into different areas of different socioeconomic factors. So bus has a much more diverse ridership. So we didn't see that as much. And I think what's interesting is that by the end of the year, weekday average, when we looked at the weekday, that was still down 51%. But when we looked at the weekend ridership, that was only down 20% from what we would normally expect. So you can see that, bus is coming back, and buses, I think that the takeaway that I pull from all this is that bus is really an important mode that people use. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of traffic on the Beltway on the inner loop. This was a good sensor. When I looked through the data, this was a reliable sensor. This is pulled off of sensor data, so it's kind of raw in that fashion. But I think what's interesting is that you see that at the beginning of 2020, highway volumes were a little bit up, and that then all of a sudden you had this huge drop as would be expected in March. But as we look at it now, if we look at in April, you can see it's coming back up there. It's like 10% less than what it would normally be. I think what's also interesting was when we dug into aggregated data for non-freeways, we could see that in the morning, when you typically only have trips going to work, this was in April of this year, it was 23% down. But if we looked at midday, it was only 5% down. So almost midday is back to normal traffic levels. And I think a lot of you see that when you're out on the roads. And this is important because as we see highway volumes return, I believe we'll see transit volumes return. When there's congestion on the roads and transit becomes a viable option to get places, right? Because the travel times become more equal, that's when I think we'll start to see transit demand hopefully return at that point. So next slide, please. And I just kind of, as I build off that last comment, which near-term outlook for transit in Northern Virginia, I think that, we can see that there's certainly an uptick in transit in recent months. Operators, as was pointed out earlier in the meeting, are increasing service. And some have even increased service over levels that they were in previous years with new service that had rolled out. But we see that service levels, revenue miles are returning. And I just want to say that telework has a big impact on ridership, but it has more of an impact on rail, and that bus is less impacted by telework as compared to rail. And that bus continues to be a key mode for many of the what we call frontline workers in the region. So that's kind of my snapshot for you of transit this evening, and we can, Kate, I guess we can answer questions or entertain them later, whichever's best.
I think we have a few minutes for questions before we go into our last couple items before closed session. Thank you for this, and a lot of really interesting nuggets in there, especially about bus versus rail, which I think is consistent with some of the conversations we've been having regarding WMATA. And it makes sense that it would be reflected in Northern Virginia offerings too. Colleagues, questions for Mr. Goldfarb about the transit center's analysis?
Madam Chair, I have this is Delegate Krizak.
Please.
I have two questions. One, what first question is about tourism. How is that? And I know you guys we've talked about that, and it's not as big a driver of metro usage, but how has that impacted negatively the ridership?
So yeah, I can look at tourism. I didn't look up tourism because usually tourism are shorter trips, right? Because the location of the hotel to the attractions is usually a shorter distance. I can check and see if we have some data sources, some probe data on tourism, and I can get back to you on that.
Okay, and then the other question I have is I don't understand the nexus between telework and drop off of rider. I mean, in the general sense, yes, it makes sense that you get a drop off of ridership because people are teleworking, no doubt. But how does that square up with your graph that shows the drive time with with car driving is almost equal to what it was? It's 5 to 10% off what it was prior to the pandemic. So are you saying that the teleworkers are people that don't drive cars?
No, I'm sorry. I failed to communicate that point well. My apologies. Telework drives the percent of people that are going to be on the roads, right? For commuters, that's what really it impacts our transportation network, highway and transit, the greatest, right? So when we look at the highway volume was just a highway volume across the whole day on that chart, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean in the peak. I did look at an aggregated number for the peak, and it was still down quite a bit from what you would expect, the morning peak, right? Normal, right? So people are out driving on the roads for different trip purposes. But what I'm trying to get across is that we still have a high percent of telework, higher than before, right? And until that telework, people start to go back to the office, right? We won't see a growth in transit again, right? But the other factor that plays into that too is that there has to be congestion on the roadways, or there has to be some incentive for someone to take transit if they own a car. If they're transit dependent, they don't have a choice, right? But you see that more in the suburban areas, we're going to have less transit dependency because that's the way that the network's structured, right? So I think that in the long run, we might not see the levels of transit we saw before, but at some time, we will return to more transit than we have today.
And the last question to follow up, do we know what that percentage is? How much congestion? Like, is there a point where we see ridership increase dramatically on the metro because congestion is at that critical tipping point?
I can look into that because we did some sensitivity modeling last year where we looked at different telework percentages and what impact that had on the roads. So if I can pull together some of the data from that for you, if that would be helpful.
Sure, that would be great. Thank you.
That's such an interesting question. I can't help but wonder, like, shouldn't our toll revenue be able to shed some insight to at what point does congestion become so bad and the price becomes so high that it starts to fall again because people make other choices? But I can imagine that requires a fair amount of assumption in modeling that out too. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, in that case, we'll move on. What an interesting presentation. Thank you. And thank you too for the conversation on Envision Route 7. It's great to see that proceeding.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, well, we will move next into VRE. We do have an action item for VRE this month. Let me first welcome Elizabeth Gunnar Parker, the chair of the operations board for the Virginia Railway Express, to tell us a little bit about our action item, and then introduce Mr. Dalton, the CEO.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We do have one VRE action tonight, Resolution 2444, which will authorize the VRE CEO to execute the amended and restated operating access agreement and the amended master lease agreement with CSX Transportation. The changes to these agreements are a result of the Transforming Rail in Virginia program, as they reflect changes to the contractual relationship between NVTC, PRTC, and CSX, given the Commonwealth's acquisition of the right-of-way. Although the Commonwealth has acquired the right-of-way, CSX will continue to dispatch and maintain both CSX and the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority-owned tracks. The commissions will continue to lease station property from CSX that is not part of the acquisition by the Commonwealth. So the commissions need to approve these agreements, and the current agreement with CSX expires at the end of next month. So with that, I'd like to ask Mr. Dalton, our CEO, to give a quick overview of the substantive provisions of the new agreements.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Vice Mayor and Chair of the Operations Board. Yeah, let me just, I'll just add a couple of things here. Essentially, because as mentioned, CSX will continue to dispatch and maintain both the CSX corridor and the property that the Commonwealth acquired. And so essentially on the surface, things will generally be the same, but there are a couple of different or a couple of enhancements here. As most of you know, throughout the life of VRE, in all of its host railroad agreements, they've been generally at these 5-year increments. And so with the Transforming Rail in Virginia and subsequently the agreements that we've entered into with the Commonwealth, those will no longer be 5-year increments. It'll be the access agreements will be coterminous with the Comprehensive Rail and Joint Operations Maintenance Agreement, which are 100-year agreements, unless terminated earlier. So that's a substantial change. The current fees that we pay will remain the same, but just as Transforming Rail in Virginia, as those planned infrastructure improvements are put into place, essentially VRE will operate less on CSX right-of-way and more on the Commonwealth's right-of-way, and the cost structure that's been contemplated in those future agreements deal more with with actual cost sharing and that type of stuff. So we'll likely get away from train mile lease fees. Also just want to point out on the station leases, yes, there will be footprints of stations that remain within the CSX right-of-way. And as most of you know, over the years, we've paid a lease fee there. And CSX has agreed to relieve the commissions of their obligation going forward to pay rent for any existing structures or any planned improvements at those locations in the near future. I will also add that obviously there was a provision in the previous agreement that had the commissions committed to constructing a third mainline track. Of course, that's now part of the Comprehensive Rail Agreement. So with that, Madam Chair, that's my summary.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn next to our VRE chair to make that motion if she hasn't already. But
Yes. Sorry.
Cool. Yeah, sure. Any questions before we go to it? Okay.
Madam Chair,
Seeing none- please.
Sure, just for record purposes, this has been reviewed by council and has the recommendation of council, and I would assume as it's being proposed that it's been reviewed and it's a good deal from the VRE perspective, just for record purposes.
Absolutely. Not only reviewed by council, but I think bears the fingerprints of council, right? Mr. McIsaac has been at the table on this one.
Yes, Madam Chair. I will say, Mr. Snyder, that I certainly recommend the agreement. I think that I say that with the recognition that relationships with a freight railroad are always fraught, and you will not always get exactly what you need. But I will say that this agreement is certainly no worse than the agreement we've had over the years, and it's actually better in a number of respects. So I would say that our posture with CSX is actually improved in some ways, and I certainly would support your adoption of the agreement.
Thank you. Glad to hear.
It's a great question for the record. Absolutely. Okay. So I think hearing nor seeing any others, let me go back to Ms. Bennett Parker or Chair Bennett Parker for a motion.
Madam Chair, I would move to approve Resolution 2444.
Second, DeFerranti.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? Seeing none. I can't get everyone's boxes in my screen at one time, so I'm going to do a quick scroll. All right, seeing none, I think we are ready for a roll call vote. I'm going to invite Ms. Gilchrist to call that vote.
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Gary.
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn.
Aye.
Mr. Bell.
Aye.
Ms. Bennett Parker.
Aye.
Mr. DeFerranti.
Aye.
Mr. Eben.
Aye.
Ms. Filler-Korn. Mr. Faust. Ms. Garvey.
Aye.
Mr. Krizik.
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau.
Aye.
Mr. Meyer. Ms. Palchik.
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Smedberg.
Aye.
Mr. Snyder.
Aye.
Mr. Stork.
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Mr. Turner.
Aye.
Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
The motion passes. I'll turn it back to the chair.
And actually, if it matters, Eileen Filler-Korn is an aye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry.
Absolutely, for the record, especially. All right, and Mr. Dalton, did you have anything else as part of your CEO report for us tonight?
I do. I can be very concise here.
Great.
If you like. Yeah. Would just like to just hit a couple of highlights. Of course, you have the VRE CEO report and the update memo in your packet. So again, I'll just speak to a couple of highlights. We do continue to operate at a reduced service level, referred to as our S+ schedule, and just numerically, our full service is 32 trains. We're currently operating at 18 trains. Do want to point out the Transportation Security Administration, or the TSA, is extending the face mask requirement for individuals across all transportation networks throughout the United States. And that includes all the rail systems, commuter rail through September 13th. The initial face mask requirement went into effect February 1st and was set to expire on May 11th. For the month of April, we continue to see ridership gradually increase to slightly over 1,500 average daily riders and continues to climb. Our on-time performance for the month was 93% system-wide. On the ridership front, we've been monitoring ridership and all other factors, and including the projected reopening of federal agencies and other employers, and continue to see those projections indicate the return of riders starting modestly after Memorial Day, with the return accelerating around Labor Day. We've also received feedback directly from our riders that indicate that the current reduced level of service has caused them to seek other means to commute, but will come back to VRE once we return to a full schedule. And again, that's 32 daily trains. For example, we're currently conducting a social media survey of former VRE riders. To date, and that we've received about slightly less than 400 responses, and that survey continues. To date, about 57% of the respondents indicate they would use VRE to commute when VRE returns to a full schedule, and another 31% indicate that they would, as you know, they'd return once their employers reopen their offices. So with all that input, we're currently working with staff, host railroads, and our contracted service providers to look at, you know, a target date to return to full service. I've actually put a marker out there on June 1st, because what we'll need to be able to do is come back to a full service and still maintain onboard social distancing and all those other health and safety required processes. So that's what we're currently looking at. I did also want to say in that survey, our posts also attracted comments from our current riders. Virtually all of course, favor a return to full service. And then finally, Madam Chair, I just appreciate the help of the jurisdictional communication staff and operations board members who posted and shared this survey. That is the end of my report, Madam Chair.
Thanks so much, Mr. Dalton. Appreciate that. All right, very good. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and move us on into our report from the Department of Rail and Public Transportation, our state partners. We are joined by Director Mitchell, who spoke earlier in the evening, as well as Mr. Brule, who I believe is here to give us a presentation on the Springfield to Quantico Enhanced Public Transportation Study. So over to you both. I think Director Mitchell first.
Sure, thank you very much. And I will keep this very brief. I'll refer everybody to our written report. Just a few items of note, though, since our last meeting. We have hired an executive director for the New Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. His name is DJ Stadler. He was a former chief operating officer and chief administrative officer with Amtrak for a number of years. So he has a lot of experience working with VRE as well. He lives in Fredericksburg and rode at VRE every day, and we're very excited to have him on board. His official date was on Monday, the April 26th. And in addition to that, we've also hired as the chief operating officer Michael McLaughlin, who was formerly our chief of rail with DRPT. He's now over at VPRA. Additionally, our CFO, Steve Pittard, has now also gone over to VPRA as our new chief financial officer there as well. So we're beginning to fill out the team there. We had an announcement yesterday with the governor in Christiansburg that we've reached an agreement with Norfolk Southern on a second train serving Roanoke, and then an eventual extension of both those trains into Christiansburg in the New River Valley. That is relevant to Northern Virginia because it does also provide service to the Northern Virginia jurisdictions, including the stations that we have along the Manassas line and Alexandria as well. So we expect that service to begin early next year. With that, I'm going to actually now turn it over to Jennifer DeBrule, our Chief of Transit. She's going to talk with you about our Springfield to Quantico Enhanced Public Transportation Study.
Thanks, Director Mitchell. It's a pleasure to be here this evening and to provide a briefing on our Springfield to Quantico study that we have underway. If I could get my slides. I promise I will be brief. I know it's been a long evening. So we can go to the next slide. Just by way of background, this study was really initiated as a result of a budget amendment in the 2020 General Assembly session that directed the DRPT to conduct a feasibility study. That legislative language is on the screen, but it is really to look at high capacity transit options between Springfield and the Franconia Springfield Metro Station south to Quantico. The study itself must be completed by December 1st of this year, and we are looking at a range of multimodal transit investments as a part of this study. Next slide. So in terms of our objectives, we are conducting a comprehensive objective evaluation of a range of potential enhanced transit alternatives in the corridor. We're going to look at costs and benefits and the impacts of each of these options. really to inform recommendations about future investment in the corridor. We're really looking way out into the future. We want to put together the most informative feasibility study that we can to help inform that future decision making. Next slide. So in terms of our study area, we are looking at basically between the VRE line where it's heading out to Manassas, south to the Prince William Stafford County line, in an area generally around the 95 and Route 1 corridors. Now, while this is our study area and where we're looking at potential alternatives for transit, we are using regional modeling and counting for trips from around the region in doing that modeling, especially with major attractors like Fort Belvoir and Quantico as part of the study area. So while this is our study area, we are looking at the region as a whole in terms of projecting our trips into the future. Next slide. So what are our key issues that we're going to consider? We want to look at our existing and future transit demand. There have been a lot of studies in this corridor, so we do also want to look at other planned transportation improvements, plans for transit supportive development in the area, access to the military bases. As Dan Goldfarb addressed earlier, obviously short and long-term trends in transit ridership and telecommuting are going to be very important in formulating these recommendations. Along with metro rail system capacity, this group knows as well as anybody, we have challenges with the Rosalind Tunnel and core capacity on the metro rail system that does impact how we can look at future potential expansion. While we talk about capital a lot in studies like this, we also need to talk about the operating costs of any potential transit investments and the funding and governance of any potential WMATA expansions and the impacts on the compact. Next slide, please. So in terms of our technical approach, we'll draw your attention to the red arrows on the left-hand side. That is what I would say is our more traditional transit study, where we're looking at different transit alternatives, testing those and evaluating them on the basis of a number of evaluation measures. What makes this study a little unique is that we have those arrows on the right-hand side that are focused on land use. And we do have a very strong land use component to this study, looking at some different scenarios around planned growth, some different alternative land use scenarios that would provide for enhanced opportunities for high capacity transit. We'll be testing and evaluating those land use scenarios and their impacts on transit separate from that more traditional element of the study. Those two pieces come back together in terms of the formulation of our study recommendations, which we will complete by the end of this year. Next slide. So like in any study, we've started out by looking at needs. We've heard from residents in the corridor. We've heard from a variety of stakeholders. And there are a lot of needs in this particular part of the region, looking at the quality of transit service that's available, the future development that is planned in that region, equity issues and making connections to low-income and minority populations and connecting them to jobs. We have major activity centers in this corridor that don't have good transit connections today at Fort Belvoir and Quantico, significant traffic congestion and unreliable travel times, and then access to our transit services that are available today is really reliant on getting in a car or taking a long walk to the bus, and what other options do we have available. So we have a well-documented set of needs that we're looking at as the basis of the study. Next slide. I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about the land use assessment and the land use side of the study. We are starting off with our assessment looking at some different mobility hubs or areas of density that could be potential transit station areas. We really want to lean into our DRPT multimodal system design guidelines that we updated last year. They give us a basis to develop some land use scenarios and recommendations. We're going to work through a process with the local governments to put together some different scenarios and evaluate the impact of those land use scenarios on our transit alternatives. all with the intent of providing that information to the local government. It's there for them to inform their local land use planning efforts that are ongoing. Next slide. So as we get the assessment completed on the land use side, we will be developing some different land use scenarios. We do intend to do a more detailed land use scenario planning around 10 potential site locations, potential station locations, considering the local comprehensive plans and some different alternatives around future land use and zoning. Next slide, please. So on the screen is a map of the potential alternatives that we're looking at. These lines are illustrative in nature and they're for the purpose of testing feasibility. Just to walk you through the high capacity alternatives that we're looking at, we are looking at a blue line Metro Rail extension south from Franconia Springfield. We're looking at a yellow line Metro Rail extension south from Huntington along the BRT corridor. We're looking at a bus rapid transit alternative and also the potential for increased frequency along the existing VRE alignment, and that would be frequency beyond what is currently contemplated in the Transforming Rail in Virginia program of projects. Next slide, please. We are also looking at an express bus alternative or a series of potential express bus alternatives connecting major origins and destinations within the study area to points beyond. So we are looking at those as well. Next slide. We have a very detailed approach to public outreach. We really want to do as much as we can to reach our stakeholders, both members of the public and community organizations, as well as our local government and commission, transit agency, and Department of Defense stakeholders. We're using a variety of different tools. We have a project website up. You can find that on DRPT's website with a fact sheet and some other information that's available there. We are hoping that as the study progresses, we hope to be able to get out in the community more as conditions improve, but we are already working. We can go to the next slide. We are already working to engage the public in the study. We do have a technical advisory committee that includes staff from NVTC and from the local jurisdictions and transit providers in the study area. That group's meeting monthly and is providing us with lots of good input and review of our key deliverables as the study is moving forward. We do have public outreach underway. We held our first public meeting virtually earlier this week, and that is one of several that are planned. That's an opportunity, and we have other opportunities in mind to reach out to the public. We do have a public survey that is underway. That survey will be open through the 17th of this month. We are pleased that we've already gotten a tremendous response to it. Over 600 surveys have been completed, but appreciate any assistance that you can provide in helping to get the word out so we can get more feedback from the public through that survey. We're also doing regular elected officials briefings for elected officials in that study area. That's a venue for us to share where we are with the study and get input from elected officials as the study progresses. Next slide, please. So wrapping up, in terms of our timeline, we are really in the thick of the study right now, working on our transit alternatives and our land use alternatives. We've just had our first round of public meetings. We will, through the summer, be moving into the more detailed and in-depth analysis of those potential alternatives, both for transit and land use, looking at costs and benefits of the different alternatives as we work towards having a draft report and recommendations to share in September. We are on track to complete the study and meet that deadline of December 1st to submit our final report to the General Assembly. So that concludes my briefing. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bruhl. And before that, thank you, Director Mitchell. It's great to hear about Mike, although we'll certainly miss seeing him at our VRE meetings as an alternate, although possibly very much in his new capacity. Okay, questions for Mr. Bruhl on the Springfield Aquatico project or any of the other comments from Director Mitchell? Okay, seeing none, I think we are going to move into our last but never least open session item of the night, which is an executive director report from Ms. Matthijs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as always, I encourage you to read the Executive Director newsletter that is included in your materials, as well as our financial reports for both February and March. So just as a reminder, our next meeting will be June 3rd, and we'll obviously keep you posted as we look to opening our doors potentially in July for having commissioners here. The WMATA committee, as you've heard, is going to be meeting on May 20th at 6 p.m. and then again on June 30th at 6 p.m. And they're going to be focusing on that annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA, as well as the next phases of the 3% cap working group. Transitioning, we've obviously talked a lot about people getting back on transit. We are actually about 6 weeks away from the end of our regional marketing campaign, which kicked off in January. Just as a reminder, the campaign was made possible from a grant from DRPT and local matches of funding from Arlington and Fairfax counties, cities of Falls Church and Fairfax, as well as VRE and OmniRide. So our radio advertising wrapped up last week, but you'll still see ads on social media, YouTube, and on the streaming video services. And so one of the main goals of the campaign was to drive people to the novarides.org site, which actually is a gateway to be able to do trip finding pretty much anywhere in our region. And our data so far has found that we're performing well above the benchmarks that we expected for this. We've had more than 9,000 visits to the website, including more than 7,000 unique visits. And just a little side, as I was joking with Matt Freeman, who's running this, it's not just me clicking 9,000 times, I promise you. I actually have used it though, I will say. And so, you know, getting a little wonky in data points for advertising, but the benchmark click-through rate is the number of people who saw the ad and then clicked through to our website is 0.06%, which is, and it's 0.17 on Facebook, whatever. I put this data out there, but what we're really hearing from the experts is that this is actually incredibly strong and well-performing for this type of advertising. So I think we got a very good value for our money. On the radio side of things, our ads on WMU, they actually coincided with the end of a very popular Kojo Namdi show. And so we had a lot of activity there, drove for every one time, let me see if they get, for every time they aired, we were getting about 1.5 to 2 visits to our website for every single ad we had, which again, in advertising world is great stuff. And so anyway, so really happy. That's obviously going to keep going through for the next 6 weeks or so. We've heard a couple things earlier today, looking ahead, the commission in July, that meeting on July 2nd, we're going to have a number of different presentations related to fare free and low fare transit policy options, including a white paper that we're working on. So as you've heard, the Program Advisory Committee did receive an overview in April, and we're going to continue, obviously, even in the nexus to WMATA. There's a lot of conversations in this space. We're actually looking forward to having a really good conversation, providing you a lot of things to think about and discuss at our July meeting. Finally, I do want to do a shout out to Matt Chang on our staff, who I hope is joining us on YouTube. If not, we'll have him come back and watch it later. So Matt is actually going to be leaving us, and Matt joined NVTC as actually a transit fellow in 2017 and was promoted to program analyst in 2018. And in addition to all of his tireless efforts to support the transit agencies on a lot of that T-Best technical work that Dan was talking about earlier, Matt really shined during both the 2019 and 2020 Metro Rail shutdowns, where he basically coordinated, I can't say hundreds of people, but definitely dozens of people across the region on these major meetings to talk through how we can move people during both of those big shutdowns. So he's really just been an amazing part of our team. He's also the creator of many of our really cool graphics and maps, like you may have seen in the commuter choice. So Matt's going to be greatly missed at NVTC. He's got a bright future ahead of him. He's heading up to Boston to do some graduate studies, so we wish him very, very well. And so just, big thank you to Matt for all of his hard work. Now I do normally we don't talk a lot about our financial reports. I actually do want to take a moment and return back over to Scott to talk about kind of what's going on with our gas tax. That is regional revenues that all of our localities are using to pay the Metro bill. And I thought it's important to sort of circle back, see where we are, and there's some nuances with the data that I thought it'd be helpful for Scott just to mention as you look at that data trends. So Scott.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to point out something in the March financials regarding the gas tax collections. The gas tax chart on page 6 shows a spike in collections for March. Unfortunately, it's not our gas tax collections rebounding, but rather it's an adjustment from December. When NVTC received the December gas tax info from the DMV, they're the ones who administer the tax, we discovered what appeared to be an error in reporting by a taxpayer. And DMV confirmed this and requested the taxpayer file a corrected return, and the correction took place in March. So if that adjustment is moved to December where it belongs from March, the revenue would appear to be just about flat from September through March. That's all I really wanted to say about that.
So again, Madam Chair, if I could, obviously we're watching that revenue source very closely. Like we talk about traffic going up, we want to see is there something happening with the regional gas tax. And so I just didn't want folks to say that, yay, we're back to normal. Not yet. So we obviously watch those very closely on behalf of our jurisdictions.
Great. Thank you both. Okay, so from here, we are going to move into our closed session. Thank you for everyone for bearing with us tonight. For the benefit of those who are listening along on YouTube, including Matt Chang, by the way, thank you so much on behalf of commissioners, as well as Ms. Mattice for everything that you've done to serve the whole region. We appreciate you and you will be missed. So for Matt, anybody else participating on YouTube following along, we will be returning to open session to certify and potentially take a vote. So the YouTube feed is going to be continued. You'll see a notice stating that we're in closed session and then resume live when we get out. Commissioners, if you could just remain on this WebEx link. The rest of the staff are going to be put on a WebEx lobby. I am going to go ahead and just make this motion myself to go into closed session, which is as follows. Pursuant to the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, Section 2.23711A1 of the Code of Virginia, the NVTC moves to convene a closed session to discuss a personnel matter concerning an appointee of the commission. Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Senator Eben. Let's do, unless there's any discussion, I don't think I'm seeing any hands. Let's do a quick roll call vote on that motion. Ms. Gilchrist?
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Gary.
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn.
Aye.
Mr. Bell.
Aye.
Ms. Bennett Parker.
Aye.
Mr. Dave Ferrenti.
Aye.
Mr. Eben.
Aye.
Ms. Filler Korn.
Aye.
Mr. Faust. Ms. Garvey.
Aye.
Mr. Krizik.
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau.
Aye.
Mr. Meyer. Pelchick.
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Smedberg.
Aye.
Mr. Snyder.
Aye.
Mr. Stork.
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Mr. Turner. Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
The motion passes. Turn it back to the chair.
Okay. Thank you so much. So we are now in closed.
We're almost there.
Okay.
Can you say something really fast so I can test it?
Yes, absolutely. Testing. Testing, testing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Working?
I think we're good.
Great.
Only thing is, it looks like Rhonda's having trouble getting back in. Does she need to do the roll call or can Kate do that?
I'm happy to do that.
I bet Kate can do that. Absolutely. Okay, so let's do that. And we're broadcasting, right, Melissa?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Well, welcome back, everyone. Let me first take a vote on the closed session certification. I will go ahead and make the motion to certify it, which is, excuse me, as follows: that NVCT certifies that to the best of each member's knowledge. Got some feedback. I don't know if folks wouldn't mind muting themselves. Thank you. Okay, so we certify, NVTC certifies that to the best of each member's knowledge and with no individual member dissenting at the just concluded closed session, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements under the Freedom of Information Act were discussed. And further, only such public business matters as were identified in the motion by which the closed session was convened were heard, discussed, or considered. Do I have a second?
Second, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mattice will call the roll.
Chair Crystal?
Aye.
Mr. Aguirre? Mr. Alcorn?
Aye.
Mr. Bell?
Aye.
Ms. Bennett Parker?
Aye.
Mr. DeFerrenti?
Aye.
Mr. Eben?
Aye.
Ms. Filler-Korn?
Aye.
Mr. Faust? Ms. Garvey?
Aye.
Mr. Krizik?
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau?
Aye.
Mr. Meyer? Ms. Palchik?
Aye.
Mr. Reed? Mr. Smedberg?
Aye.
Mr. Snyder?
Aye.
Mr. Stork?
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan?
Aye.
Mr. Turner?
Aye.
Mr. Walkinshaw?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we do have a resolution before us coming out of closed session. I'm going to turn to Ms. Bennett Parker, the chair of the Operations Board of VRE, to make that motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move approval of Resolution 2445 regarding the appointment of VRE General Counsel and Chief Legal Officer in recognition of the increasing complexity of passenger rail in Virginia and as we prepare to seize the transformative opportunities ahead for commuter transit in the region.
I'd be happy to second that. Thank you. Did you wish to speak any further to it, Ms. Bennett Parker? I know you did in making the motion.
I did. I think on behalf of the VRE board, I think we're excited to see this motion move forward.
Excellent, thank you. And I will note as well that our colleagues at the Potomac and Rappahannock Transportation Commission, our co-parent of VRE, voted to approve the same resolution this evening earlier at their meeting. I'm happy to support it. Is there any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, we will call a vote one last time in this long evening. Let me turn it again to Ms. Mattice to call that vote.
Well, I'm actually going to get Rhonda was able to log in, so I'm going to give her the
welcome back. We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
Back to you,
Okay.
Rhonda.
Chair Crystal,
Aye.
Mr. Aguirre. Mr. Aguirre? Mr. Aguirre? Oh, okay, I see you. Mr. Elkhorn?
Aye.
Mr. Bell?
Aye.
Ms. Bennett Parker?
Aye.
Mr. DeFerrenti?
Aye.
Mr. Eben?
Aye.
Ms. Filler-Korn?
Aye.
Mr. Faust? Ms. Garvey?
Aye.
Mr. Krizik?
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau?
Aye.
Mr. Meyer? Ms. Palchik?
Aye.
Mr. Reed? Mr. Smedberg?
Aye.
Mr. Snyder?
Aye.
Mr. Stork?
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan?
Aye.
Mr. Turner?
Aye.
Mr. Walkinshaw?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you very much. Okay, colleagues, any other business to come before the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission tonight? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing everyone on June 3rd.
Thank you.
Everybody. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks a lot.
Night, everyone.
Good night.
Congratulations, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to all of you.